Magandang hapon sa inyong lahat. This is Nico Vitug. Welcome to the second installment of the class lecture series. Itong ating lecture series and today's event is held in cooperation with the University of Santo Tomas's Unitas Journal, which is headed by Editor-in-Chief Maria Luisa Torres Reyes, who is also the Editor Emerita of the Ateneo de Manila University's Critical Cultura Journal. So bago po tayo mag-umpisa para sa ating mga viewers, for our viewers today, do give a react to our post. And if you'd like to say hello, please just post your greetings on the comments section. So do give us a shout out. So magandang hapon po sa inyong lahat. The class lecture series is primarily geared toward developing up-to-date, flexible, and relevant ways of teaching a range of subjects offered in the Commission on Higher Education's new AB Literature curriculum. In the context of the teaching and learning limitations imposed by the quite prolonged COVID pandemic, topics of the online lectures range from new curricular content to the pedagogy in the classroom delivery of the syllabus. Colleagues who are esteemed experts in their particular fields have agreed to be part of the lecture series covering topics such as mandated subjects like cultural studies, creative writing, critical theory, literature content courses, and the use of technology in the classroom, ClassNet setting, among others. Guest speakers have been requested to share their ideas and experience in teaching particular subjects in relation to the syllabus, pedagogy, teaching tools, materials, and classroom techniques that they use, focusing on any of your best practices. A question and answer portion will follow the lecture with audience. So, ngayong hapon, today's installment of the class lecture series is about teaching Southeast Asian cultural studies. Please let me read the abstract to you. Southeast Asia is a challenging area to teach because it is a multidisciplinary field that covers a region unified only by its diversity. Literature teachers face several difficulties in synthesizing literary and cultural traditions and productions that are expressed from diverse linguistic landscapes and that have emerged from varied historical conjunctures, diverging colonial experiences, producing vastly different contemporary realities. There are, however, points of convergences where where one's national histories and stories get to be intertwined or mirrored in another country in the region. It is through these points of contact and entanglements that we can perhaps offer a way of understanding and teaching the literary and cultural underpinnings of contemporary Southeast Asia. This presentation examines the teaching of Southeast Asian literature and culture through a comparative and transnational lens that allows students to appreciate the region's rich traditions and heritage. Through the discussion of the course design, select modules and activities in my Introduction to Southeast Asian Literary and Cultural Studies class, I will explain how I teach the course through the themes of colonial and post-colonial violence, race and ethnicity, religion and spirituality, gender and desire, and diaspora and mobilities. So please let me introduce our speaker this afternoon, who is no other than Dr. Carlos Piocos. Carlos M. Piocos III is a full professor at the Department of Literature at De La Salle University. He is also an associate for poetry and cultural studies at the Benvenido N. Santos Creative Writing Center, a research fellow at the Southeast Asia Research Center and Hub, and the managing editor of ACDA, the Asian Journal of Literature, Culture, and Performance. He has published widely on cinema, writing, gender, sexuality, social movements, and transnationalism in international peer-reviewed journals, and his book, Narratives, Affect, and Politics of Southeast Asian Migration, was published by Routledge in 2021. He also edited and translated an anthology of Indonesian migrant women's fiction, Bantay sa Lakay sa Loob ng Aking Bahay, published by Sentro ng Wikang Pilipino in 2020. Piocos is also a poet, and he authored two poetry books, Corpus, published by UST Publishing House in 2010, and Kung ang Syudad ay Pag-ibig, published by UP Press in 2019. Ladies and gentlemen, let us all give a round of online applause to our esteemed speaker, Dr. Carlos Piocos.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Nico, for that wonderful introduction and also for moderating today's event. Maraming salamat for sharing your time for this particular lecture. I would also like to thank Dr. and Professor Maria Luisa Torres Reyes, or Madam Lulu, for the invitation to do a lecture on this topic. Parang mahirap kasi mahindian si Ma'am Lulu for these kinds of speaking requests. So thank you very much for the opportunity to talk about my course. And also thank you very much Ray Francis Kilantang and Kimberly Panis for assisting me for today's event. Maraming salamat. So today I'm going to talk about my course, teaching my course Southeast Asian, Introduction to Southeast Asian Literary and Cultural Studies. I titled this talk as, and I'm going to frame this talk as a sort of a question of connection. So later on I will try to divulge on this further, but I talk about it as in the form, or try to describe it in the form of uneasy connections. So when we think about Southeast Asia, as teachers, how are we connected to this subject? And as we share our knowledge to our student, how do we begin to cultivate a sense of connection to a region that they, by the accident of geography, birth, and biology, they are connected to automatically. And I frame it as an easy because all of these things are not, all of these ideas are not sort of automatic or inherent in when we think about it. And also on easy connections because we are all until now conducting our classes in online during the pandemic as part of the challenges of the pandemic. And most of the time, we would be facing the difficulties of the kind of technological infrastructures that we have. And I think we will go into that a little bit as we go into today's lecture. And I hope you can engage for our today's discussion. And I'll be looking forward to your questions later on. So before I begin to show you my course, I would like to offer a little bit of an introduction to some of the issues, theoretical and also practical issues of teaching the course, just to also frame and discuss how my course end up in that particular way. And I hope in this process, I'll be able to also give you some or offer you some ideas and some of the ways that you can teach this course. Now, the thing about Southeast Asian literary and cultural studies as a course that we can teach is that even though you are, for example, you can integrate some of the lessons, some of the texts, and some of the materials that we will go through for today's discussion, even if you're teaching, for example, in senior high with 21st century literatures of the Philippines and the world, because much of the materials are part of the world literature canon. And at the same time, they're very contemporary. They're still in this century. That's why it's going to be easy and accessible for our Gen Z students nowadays. And of course, if you're teaching world literatures in as a GE course or one of the required courses in college, you can also integrate some weeks teaching particularly Southeast Asian texts. So I hope that this is something that you could use. Or if you're teaching, if you are an AB literature professor, you can, and there is a subject, a course that is one of the required courses in the new curriculum. Yun nga yung Literatures of Asia 2 or parang Literatures from Southeast Asia. So Southeast Asian literary and cultural traditions. And there is also a BA degree program, Southeast Asian Studies, that is offered in many of Philippine universities. So this is something yung introduction to Southeast Asian literary and cultural studies. This is one of the required courses in that degree. So hopefully today's discussion you'll find relevance in some of the texts and some of the modules that I'll be presenting later on. So, but it's very important to kind of think about where Southeast Asia is situated as a form of knowledge. How did it arise? How did it emerge as an object of inquiry and as something that we research and study on? And as well as it's also important to look at how it gains some form of legitimacy in the academe in ways that it would create institutions, diba? Southeast Asian research centers in many of Western and even Asian universities. How did it came about? And of course, when did it parang lose favor in some parts of the world, and when did it gain favor or become something that universities and institutions found still to be relevant in some other parts of the world. So Southeast Asia as an idea is a modern invention, particularly an invention of modern European expansionism or colonialism. So the ways in which we imagine Southeast Asia is produced by colonialism, diba? With how the Western powers has divided this, or sort of in the geography of colonialism, a sort of create this region for us. So kasi masyadong, di ba, parang Oriental and Far East is too all-encompassing. So they still, all of these colonial powers also need to divide it further. And thus, we have Southeast Asia. So in many ways, we have to situate that and contextualize that a lot of the ways in which knowledge is produced, in which Southeast Asia become knowable, the conditions of possibility that Southeast Asia becomes something as an object of study has to be traced back in as a form of colonial legacy. So it's so hard to ignore colonialism when we are discussing Southeast Asia, even though many of the materials that you will be using are in fact contemporary. Diba? We have to make our students appreciate and understand how much of the ways in which we think about Southeast Asia is formed and is still informed by colonialism. And we can see those kinds of legacies even in the larger politics involved, a little bit more contemporary, just 50 years before, how more than 50 years, by 1940s, how politics of Cold War, after World War II, is sort of another colonizing gesture. How much of that history and political tensions on the global stage has created this idea of area studies. Diba? So why are the Western powers very interested in the region? Basically because of the ideological conflict at play in the world stage, diba? The threat of communism, wars in Vietnam that has affected much of the continental Southeast Asian region, countries like Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia, Myanmar, Laos, etc. And then how that affect even the archipelagic uh, archipelagic parts of Southeast Asia like the Philippines. So this is also an important historical lesson to go back into to teach Southeast Asia now is to reorient us into understanding our present predicament that we find ourselves in. Diba? A lot of these authoritarian regimes that seems to be resurging now, seems to be popular, and seems to be coming back to power, diba, just last yesterday, are product of this Cold War politics, products of the ways in which Southeast Asia become a currency as a form in this industry of knowledge production. So that has to be also taken into the account when we think about Southeast Asia. Now, what's interesting in the past few decades is that in the West, Southeast Asia has started to lose legitimacy. So there are questions about how the Southeast Asian studies is in crisis in the West, which basically include universities and academies based in the US, in Europe, and by extension, probably the richer part of Asia Pacific regions like Australia, etc. So there seems to be an intellectual crisis of intellectual legitimacy. Much of the new scholarship has been looking at how some of the knowledge that is created by eminent scholars are in fact complicit to the very problematic politics of Cold War. Makikita din natin yan ngayon. It's starting to, and these are important reckonings and parang decolonizing gestures that we need to face as teachers even and scholars. There's also a lot of institutional challenges, funding cuts because there are fewer enrollments. Basically, Southeast Asia in the West is no longer as sexy as before. Diba? Which is quite an irony because we don't study things just because they're sexy or they're chic now. But that seems to be the case. And if you do not have funding, if you don't have any enrollments, then basically you lose the steam to advance. Even though advanced scholarly and pedagogical work, even though the field is still very important. But what's interesting is that while Southeast Asian studies has been declining in the West, some people are describing that Southeast Asian studies has truly come home. Because if you've noticed, many of the most interesting cutting edge scholarship that is beginning to emerge or that has emerged in the past few decades has in fact has come from institutions and universities in Southeast Asia. So even with all of this decline, the Institute for Southeast Asian Studies based in Singapore is still very much relevant, very much vitalized even. And then we have so many centers, Southeast Asian research centers in Malaysia, in Thailand, and even in countries like Indonesia, in the Philippines, we still are gaining strength. And we're beginning to see scholars who are engaging with us and becoming much more active in producing works in English, scholars based in Vietnam, Laos, Myanmar. So we are beginning to access more and more of them because of a sort of a revitalized field, energized by translation, energized by this idea that this has been very interesting because um, uh, one of the thing that keeps a lot of Southeast Asian scholars encouraged during this time is it seems like we're now really truly talking to each other and listening to each other as scholars, and we don't need the blessings of dead old white men for us to even talk to each other. So we are now doing those exciting things. That is beginning to be, even among our Asian neighbors, uh, uh, you can see Southeast Asia as a study being is still very relevant and very much supported in universities in East and Southeast in South Asia. So, for example, you see that in Japan, in Taiwan, in India, Korea, China, Hong Kong. So all of these countries are still are also helping us see how relevant our field is. So some of these things I wanted to these are part of the ongoing conversations among Southeast Asian scholars. Number one is by an Indonesian eminent scholar, Ariel Herianto, who asked, can there be Southeast Asian in Southeast Asian studies? So because while we are central to the operation and existence of Southeast Asian studies, as Southeast Asians, we seem to occupy a subordinate position within its production and its consumption. So that's the what seems to be an ongoing irony as well. And these are the kinds of questions that are important, diba? To think about where are we as Southeast Asian in this field of knowledge that is Southeast Asian studies. So although Southeast Asians like us, like Filipinos, have every right and potential to the legitimate analysis of our own culture, or of our own literature, of ourselves, the modern intellectual apparatus, the academies, both in the West and even in our own backyards, have largely been still operating as if they are indebted and subordinate to the Western Southeast Asian institutions. So these kinds of questions are important because it calls into question who is authoring or writing the knowledge about ourselves. Diba? Who is writing? Are we writing about ourselves, or are we writing, or somebody is writing in behalf of us? So Caroline Howe has pointed Gayatri Chakraborty's PVAC on these two idea of representations that gets to be elided in its English translation, but in its German, the German original representation is both Verstelle and Darstellung. So Vertreren means I don't know which is which anymore, but basically the two ideas of representation is representation as proxy and representation as portrait. One is you are able to self-articulate the own ways in which you see yourself. Diba? That is representation as a form of portrait. Or you see representation in representative of, diba? As a proxy, or somebody else is speaking in your behalf. That is another form of representation, which is representation as proxy. So these questions are very important. So basically, that's why we need to always think about who is writing the knowledge that the things that we know about Southeast Asia, and in what ways are we disseminating those knowledge as teachers of this field. Another important question, which is Caroline Howe opened, is in her essay, "For whom are Southeast Asian studies?" So it's not just a question of who is producing knowledge. It's also a question of who is this knowledge addressed to. di ba? Because claiming that one is doing area studies in one own area, that we are studying our own country or our own people or even our own region, does not simply just resolve the issue. So it raises questions on the things about, di ba, um, our own self-knowledge, our own ways of governmentality, but also the more difficult question of how this type of effort of doing Southeast Asian studies also make and do sense of belonging to a community or place. So in a process, even if we are talking or even if we are the one producing our own knowledge, we also have to ask what kind of community are we trying to cultivate when we teach this and when we write about this and when we address it to our own sense of audience. Who are we talking to? And in what ways can we cultivate that sense of belonging? Now, I think Caroline Howe's point is very important because it strikes at the heart of the question of why must we not only study but also teach Southeast Asia. So, of course, beyond the reasons that it is required, beyond the reasons that uh, it is part of the curriculum, I think we have to think about the deeper questions, deeper reflections on why we are doing what we do as teachers, di ba? Yun naman yung mahalaga sa atin because we are not only dealing with the politics but also with the ethics of the kind of knowledge that we disseminate as teachers. So we do not just claim or lay claim to this area that we are studying because we are part of that area. We are Southeast Asian, but we needed to be able to find ways in which we can find connection to the field of study that we are inquiring into. It responds to some ideas, for example, why the Philippines, in the Philippines, we don't really think of ourselves as Southeast Asians, right? Some people, and this has been documented even among our scholars today, but we think of ourselves as Latinos that is lost in Asia. We are the Latinos of Asians because we are an other to Southeast Asia. In fact, we see ourselves as an other basically because we are Catholic, diba? In a largely Buddhist and Islam majorities among our neighbors. We are also Spanish American versus some of the other French, British, Portuguese neighbors in the region. So, parang what is the relevance of Southeast Asian studies and if our students don't really think of themselves as Southeast Asians, diba? Because they feel very different from our neighbors. But I think it's very important and we need to start to make them believe or not make them believe, but to make them think about how important it is to find community among your peers, among your neighbors, because no matter how much we fancy ourselves as Latino Americans, we will never be Latino Americans. Diba? For some accidents of geography. In as much as, diba, colonialism is also what we're beginning to see as an accident of, diba, of these deluded conquistadores who've just seen our lands as things that they can divide. Of course, that's a very violent accident that we've experienced. But yeah, it's very important to lay claim to this region because we are part of it, whether we like it or not, or whether we see ourselves as an other to it or not. In fact, perhaps, diba, some of our other neighbors think how different Southeast Asia is to them, but still, we needed to embrace this community because we are part of this community. So it is very important to cultivate that our students is also belongs to this larger community, to give them this imagination, this imaginary that they belong to Southeast Asia, because it will open up a deeper and even more cosmopolitan understanding and appreciation of what it means to be a Filipino and Southeast Asian at the same time, rather than just some sort of a hybrid connection diba? So aspiration of of Americans lost in Asia. So I think this is why it's really important to teach Southeast Asia. So far we're looking at, when we teach Southeast Asia, we needed to think about our position, and it's not just a question of location, di ba? Location by accident, that we are Filipinos and we are in Southeast Asia, therefore we needed to teach Southeast Asian studies. But where are we, or how are we positioned in this discourse, in this field of inquiry? Diba? This goes to also opens up question of who gets to write the things that we know about ourselves, and who and what legitimizes, gives power to the things that are written, diba? Institutionally, politically, etc., etc. And who is writing the knowledge? How does it get to be disseminated? And why how does it become important or gain currency? What beyond this, I think it's also important to think about, when we teach and when we go into this field, we need to think about what kind of audience are we cultivating in studying and researching and teaching Southeast Asia. What kind of students are we producing by inducting them into the study of the region? Diba? Parang, are we just going to teach them that they are Southeast Asian? Or perhaps there are deeper questions about what they can encounter when they look at themselves in the relation to their neighbors. What kind of community are we inducting them into? And what kind of community do we want them to belong? Diba? Because obviously, with all of what we can see as some of the, diba, pag nanonood tayo ng mga balita kapag may ASEAN, diba, parang it's weird that the legal political regimes at play in all of these conventions. But that is not just what creates or shapes the community. Diba? Hindi lang naman international relations ang Southeast Asia. Diba? Southeast Asia has humanity, has soul, has cultural tradition, has literary tradition, has artistic traditions that binds us as a region. And that gives and offers an alternative sense of community to our students. Diba? Beyond the question of, diba, what's happening to Myanmar, what's happening to, diba, how does China plays into Myanmar's, the things that are happening to Myanmar, and how does China plays the things that are happening to us right now. So, of course, that's part of Southeast Asian imaginary right now that we need to recognize. But beyond that, there are alternative and perhaps possibly more radical ways of envisioning community through literature and through culture. In a way, we see Southeast Asian literature this way as a way of worlding. Diba? It creates a space through imagination, through art, through written word, through rituals, through performances, etc., etc. And thus, we create, we sort of inculcate a different sense of community to our students when we teach them these things. So, yeah, it's very important, but it can also be very, very difficult. And this is why there are so many challenges in teaching Southeast Asian studies. So I can only guess for teachers who have to reckon with the fact that they needed to start, diba? Parang if you were assigned with this course, what will you do, especially at this moment in time, diba? Number one, there's always a question of expertise. And I think this is something that we always go through as teachers, diba? We always have, and as scholars sometimes, we always have that imposter syndrome. Am I enough, diba? Do I know enough to teach about the course that I'm teaching? So, and especially with Southeast Asia, it can be particularly daunting or intimidating. You might feel a sense that you needed to be an expert of all of these countries under Southeast Asia. You needed to be who is exactly an expert of Southeast Asian studies anyway? Di ba? Parang if we of course if we can go by the standard of Benedict Anderson, di ba, who's an expert of Philippine studies, who's an expert in uh, Thai studies and an expert of Indonesian studies. So parang pero sino pa nga ba talaga yung scholars ngayon na kayang mag-navigate ng more than 2 countries, di ba? So, and when you think about expertise, we have always have to think about, di ba, the sense of literary and cultural studies, itong course natin, how it is entangled with so many other disciplines. So it's hard to talk about a text, for example, about colonialism without talking about its colonial history. Diba? When we get to discuss a text that crosses borders, maraming mga kwento, for example, Thai stories in which, diba, some of the characters just came from Myanmar for some reason. So we have to think about the border studies, diba? The geography and international relations. And when you think about, diba, when we encounter stories of about puppets, diba, wayang kulit, we need to talk about art and theater and performance as well. So, ang hirap, parang may ganong feeling na do I know enough outside of my expertise as a literary or cultural scholar? So that's just the discipline. How about our idea of the country? Diba? These countries are so many different colonial histories. Diba? So, some of them may be similar. So baka may mga similarities yan. But the way that it translates into the present would be very different. Just imagine the linguistic differences then. All of these cultural and literary traditions have very different linguistic landscapes, or came from very different linguistic landscape that has its different cultural traditions, and then also very different sense of spirituality and cosmology, and diba parang of different sense of the world. So, ang hirap minsan na to lay claim that you know well enough sometimes to teach. Of course, they have complex literary and cultural histories, trajectories. And even before the pandemic, it has been difficult to access these materials. When many of these materials are in archives, different from parang kailangan mong dayuhin, have to go there. And sometimes the materials are hard to access. And even if you can access them, diba, it will be difficult to understand some texts. Linguistic access is very difficult. Our language, our capacity for another language is our access to another world. So if we are more or less have 2 languages or 3 languages within the Philippines as English, then siguro I'm seeing a lot of scholars now who are really serious about studying Bahasa Indonesia or Bahasa Melayu, which gives them access to several worlds in Southeast Asia, because Bahasa Melayu and Bahasa Indonesia is parang share some very similar linguistic characteristics. But even then, it would be very hard for them to access Thai, Vietnamese, Lao text, etc., because there's still lack of translation. So the good thing that we're seeing now is that we are seeing a lot of more and more Southeast Asians translating their fellow Southeast Asians in and sometimes and no longer via English, but direct translations. This is what Arlo Mendoza in UP and Dominic C. and a lot of other scholars who have been product of Dharma Siswa scholarship grant had been doing now. And I think it's, yeah, but they're translating Eka Kurniawan straight from Bahasa Indonesia and no longer via English. So, and then you can see uh, how different the stories are. Kasi yung sensibilities na express ng Tagalog or ng Filipino sa translation from Bahasa Indonesia. Finally, there's a limited access and awareness to some of the literary and cultural productions in the region. Parang we needed to talk about this artistic traditions more, diba? We needed to be more aware of them. But because they are inaccessible to us sometimes, it's so hard to appreciate, diba, the intricacies of the Vietnamese water puppetry, even if you watch them face to face. Kasi parang hindi natin alam yung traditions that are involved. Hindi tayo aware that are traditions that are involved in them. Just an example. And then finally, all of this becomes thousandfold difficult. All of these challenges becomes more difficult because of the pandemic. Diba? Where the already inaccessible archives becomes much more inaccessible to us now because of the pandemic. So if you're teaching Southeast Asia, what are the ways in which you could go around giving the students an introductory exploration of the region, making them interested enough to know further? So yun yung framework ko when I'm teaching Introduction to Literary and Cultural Studies in Southeast Asia, because nandoon naman yung introduction. We are not completely experts passing on our expertise. One of the things that I'm thinking about and I fashioned myself into as I was designing this course is that I won't pose as an expert because I am not an expert. I might be an expert on one thing and one thing only. And most of the time that would be migration, Southeast Asian migration, but more particularly connected to Indonesia, Singapore, and the Philippines. But outside of that, I would want to learn more about Burmese migration now, etc., etc. But that is a very niche thing as well, still. But would that qualify me to teach Southeast Asian studies or Southeast Asian literary and cultural studies? So one thing I know about myself is I've seen enough movies from Southeast Asia. I've seen enough films. I might have read enough translated materials to allow me to be able to come up with a course. And then another part of me is thinking, if a white person in the West, diba, is able to teach Southeast Asia without even thinking about all of these things that I am thinking, diba? And what does it say to us as scholars? And we are Southeast Asians already. So we have an intimate knowledge on the workings of our own backyard. Yung mga puti nga, they don't think about these questions. But these are good questions that we need to think about. So yeah, so the thing is, I don't pose as an expert in Southeast Asia, but I fashion myself as a curator. These are the materials. I've curated them for my students. I want my students to think about Southeast Asia and I frame them in particular themes. But I don't necessarily expect them to produce knowledge the same thing that I have in the same manner that I've thought about these materials. So ang ginagawa ko ay, di ba, para most of the time we prepare our slides before the lecture, especially during the pandemic. Kasi parang it's so hard teaching during the pandemic because we are talking to students who are more or less not as engaged now because of, diba, too many exhaustion, too many anxieties, etc., etc. So it feels like talking to a void, and sometimes our comfort level in teaching is usually we needed to have everything prepared so that 'Di ba parang ang hirap din kasi kapag hindi ka nag-prepare tapos you're talking to blank screens, 'di ba? Because our students don't like opening their cameras now, even for us to see their faces. So, what I usually do, and I understand that. So, but what I usually do is I curate the materials, I give them, 'di ba, all of the primary materials, and I give them some supplementary materials to help them or to deepen their understanding of some of the aspects about this, the materials that I'm making them analyze. And then they analyze it, and then I read it, and then we meet after I synthesize their responses to the materials. So my lecture is, although definitely there's preparation in what I do. Hindi naman ako balahurang teacher. I prepare, but I base all of my lecture, I base all of our interrogations with the insights that I'm calling from my students. And I'll show you later on. I'll show you my Canvas page just to demonstrate how I do it. And then, but I have to sort of find a way to uh, curate materials that would force or compel my students to look at Southeast Asia in transnational lens, to look at their neighborhood, their backyard as a ground for comparison. To use Peng Chea's word, Southeast Asia as grounds for comparisons. Or for Benedict Anderson, it's a specter of comparison. Yung Los Demonios, the demons of comparisons. Because yun nga, parang when we think about the colonial violence in Indonesia, what does it say about our own experience of colonial violence? When we think about traumas of decolonization and the kinds of conflicts that came out from post-independent states, diba? How does it runs across countries in continental, in Myanmar and Vietnam, for example? How does race play out or ethnicity play out in countries like Singapore and Malaysia? So, which makes them think about whether those same kinds of operations, diba, is something that they can also see in the Philippines. Diba? When you think about Catholicism, Buddhism, and Islam, how does it play out in the everyday lives of people as we can see in their cultural production? So these are some of the things that I'm looking at and thinking about when I curate my materials for the class. I put it in themes. So for a lack of a better term, themes where the students can do the work of comparison. So on this note, I'll shift to my an example of how I do it in my class. So in case you're interested in the syllabus that I'm using, you can download them by going to the website of that the class, and the CHED Technical Panel for Literature has developed itong ang AB Literature Philippines.com. And then you just have to find the Literatures of Asia 2. Here you can download, on this page, you can download the syllabus here. So the syllabus looks like this. And as an example of how I do my 1 week, for example, you can download the module here. So the module looks something like this. So I put here the YouTube links that you can use, and even some of the links of the poems that you can use. So basically, you can run this for a week in your class. So if you're teaching 21st century lit from the Philippines and the world, this is something that you can easily implement for two meetings or even 2 weeks. Diba? So there are activities here. But this is how it translates in the undergrad program AB Southeast Asian Studies, which is being offered by Department of International Studies in De La Salle University. So I teach one of the courses there, yung Introduction to Southeast Asian Cultural Studies or yung CCALS. So this is my Canvas page. So I'll skip through the ito yung mga format ng university format ng natin, 'di ba? May mga learning outcomes kasi tayo, outcomes based tayo ngayon. Outcomes based pa rin ba tayo? Parang hindi na may bago na bang trend? In any case, this is my learning plan. So I'm what I do here, I'm just going to explain the how I translate the themes in my courses. So, but one of the things that I realize is this is too packed. You can even lessen this, kumbaga, bawasan nyo ng 2 or 3. Pero masyadong magbigat tong ilan ba to? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yung 6 na modules. I think you can just choose think about 4 or 5. 3 or 4, 4, at least 4 para hindi ganun kabigat sa mga estudyante. Pero this is the first time that I taught this course. So some of the outputs that I'll be showing for you today are actually outputs coming from my students, the first batch that I taught CCALS or Introduction to Southeast Asian Cultural Studies, and they have given me their consent. So hindi naman sila nahihiya sa mga hindi naman kasi nakakahiya din yung kanilang outputs. Talagang mahuhusay yung mga bata. And they are not literature majors. So I do have to recalibrate them to do the act of close reading. So later on, I'll tell you some of the prompts and some of the tips that I'm using just to remind them to always do some close reading. So just an explanation, for example, so I'll talk about colonial violence. I use a short TV clip by Farish Noor. Meron siyang, he has a TV show in Channel News Asia, that is CNA. This is a Singaporean-based TV network. But this show is available online sa YouTube. It's about 5 to 6 minutes. Basically, Farish Noor acting like, Harrison Ford, Indiana Jones, is going around Southeast Asia. But talking about how the very idea of Southeast Asia is something that we inherit from our colonial history. And how, yung mga kaya Shadows of Empire. So it's a good introduction to make our students appreciate where Southeast Asia came from, diba? And then I make them read Pramoedia Anantatuer's Bumi Manusya, or This Earth of Mankind. Now, I made them read just 2 chapters just so that they can hear Pramoedia Anantatuer's voice as a writer. Diba? And then I show them a clip of an interview and a biohistory of Pramoedia, of Pram. And then I made them watch a Netflix film adaptation, a very good film adaptation of Bumi Manusya that they can watch in Netflix if they have. So, and then available on Vimeo is Balangiga's Howling Wilderness. So here we talk about parang colonial legacies, and we talk about child protagonist Minke and the unnamed 9-year-old child in the film of Can de la Cruz, Balangiga. Talk about coming into consciousness, coming into age, and colonialism as a theme of colonial violence. And then we talk about post-colonial terror, all of these horrors that came about decolonialization. So we talk about a text, a short story written by Indonesian about the violence that have founded East Timor incident by Seno Gumira Ajidarma. And then I made them read a story, a more contemporary story that talks about the experience of youth during the Orde Baru or New Order in Indonesia, written by Eka Kurniawan, which is graffiti in toilet. I I sometimes, even though they can't understand Bahasa Indonesia, yet I post the text in its original language just so that they can interface with it. Diba? Parang ganun. Parang may idea awareness sila dun sa foreign language na yon. And I make them read, if a Filipino translation is available, I make them read them. Arla Mendoza has just published a very good translation of Eka Koniyawan's book, published by Savage Mind Press, which you can, I think, buy from their website and from their Facebook. Matutuwa si Christian Cordero for free um, promotion. And then Joshua Oppenheimer's two documentaries, The Act of Killing and The Look of Silence. And then another documentary, Burma Vijay, about the violence in Myanmar. All of these, some of these films are available either in YouTube or in Vimeo. And then this one, I'm going to explain this a little bit more elaborately a little bit later. And then I make them look into. So in many of these, in my modules, they would have to watch the films, and sometimes, because I'm an evil person, I put the quizzes and embed them in the videos so that while they were watching, it will pause at certain points, and then they would have to answer quiz questions. So that helps them. That assures me that that my students are watching the materials, because believe it or not, if we just post these videos, and if they won't, if they have a choice of not watching it, they will not watch it. And I won't blame them for that, actually. So, and then they would have to watch the films, and then I made them do some podcasts. So yeah, they don't have to discuss it in class anymore. I group them into smaller groups, then they discuss it, and then the recordings are posted, and the other groups will comment on their recordings, on their discussion, because they also watch the material. So this is what I do in these films. Many of these films are available online. If they are not available online, there are many ways. And then because I'm really a scholar of migration, I look at migration cultures, I dedicate one module to talk about migration, to talk about the things that I'm a little bit more expert. I'm an expert of. So I talk about stories written by migrant women, and their translations. These are stories about Indonesian and Filipino migrant domestic workers and Bangladeshi construction workers in Singapore. So we look at Singapore as a cosmopolitan city, and at the same time, in this very progressive city, who are the ones that are excluded in nation building. And then to cap it all, we talk about queer Southeast Asia. Just to talk about this another violence of exclusion. People who are not part of the nation or nation building, usually just because of all of these moral frames about what constitutes a nation. So most of them would be queer, sex workers, etc., etc. So we talk about these queer stories, documentaries. Some of them are available online as well. And then and it's also I'm also very lucky that I get to meet scholars now, Filipino scholars who are revisiting categories of queerness, our local ideas of a queerness that are much more that speaks to us much more closer and much more intimately. Sila Jaya Jacobo talks about Agi, Bayot, etc., etc. And those and in Southeast Asia, we can see all of these terms as well. So we don't necessarily use queer in the region. We have our ways of naming some of the things, some of these phenomena. And it's interesting to cap it all here. So if you look at the whole modules, uh, I'm actually just talking about violence in its many forms. I'm talking about the violence of colonialism. I'm talking about violence that continues during the time of during the time of decolonization, yung state violence na nai-inflict just so that they can gain power. I'm talking about how Cold War politics and Cold War being staged in our region has produced violence beyond just the wrangling, ideological wrangling of capitalism and communism. There are violence in the region. And we can see that in some of the things that I'm going to discuss a little bit later. And then there is everyday violence that we can see in race, religion, and gender. There's everyday violence in the people that we don't consider as part of the community because they are foreigners, diba? Or they are minorities, sexual minorities, diba? Ethnic minorities, etc., etc. So I'm inducting them into idea that Southeast Asia is violent. But I'm also making them think about ways in which how to be able to think about sharing solidarities, sharing ways of finding connection to people who are victimized by this violence, because that is probably the story that and the community that they can find. Because after all of us are victims of this violence in different gradations and in different consequences. So on that note, I'm going to because I've been talking too long now. Just remind me if it's going too long. But I want to give you a glimpse of how I do one module. And here I'm going to discuss this module about war and trauma. And because this is some of the materials here are most accessible, some things that you can see in the YouTube, etc. So in war and trauma, I start with Myanmar's poet Kokoteth. So what I usually do is I introduce them via a short video that is available online so that they know more about the poet. Kasi of course hindi naman to these are people of color, these are Southeast Asians. They're not that well anthologized, but they are very good poets. So one of them is Kokoteth. So, and then I made them read the poem here. I scanned it. Pag Pinoy, wag nyo tong gagawin. Pero hindi kasi ito accessible eh. So, I scanned a poem, Myanmar, a collage. And, okay. And here, because they're not literature majors and sometimes we are, kahit naman tayo, di ba, we are lax with documenting our sources. So, and all of the sources that I'm putting in my canvas, I put the source line here. Sinasabi ko sa mga estudyante ko, kahit nakopyahin nyo na lang yan, basta tandaan ninyo na dapat isinasite nyo yung sources nyo. And dapat alam nyo kung paano mag-cite ng sources. And I make them, so if you look at this, even if they're just answering a discussion forum, I give them specific instructions. So, of course, I frame them, their responses in particular question. And then I tell them to do close reading by saying they have to talk about how the poet used metaphor. They have to directly cite the metaphor, not just allude to or refer to them in their discussion points. cite and discuss specific lines. So I always do this even in my yung mga panitikan classes, because we have to inculcate the citational practice always, all the time, to our students. Kasi ito yung pinakamadaling mabitawan eh. And I always tell them that this is a sign of critical thinking. How, diba? I always ask them, why is this line important to you? Why do you think this line speaks to you? And so they have to tell me the line. So for example, one of my students they would have to type the lines here, put the page numbers, and then put the source here. All of these are graded, by the way, and they can see the rubric kasi. So nababawasan yung grade nila kapag wala yung reference sa dulo, for example. These little things, I'm guessing, especially at the start, you have to really inculcate this task to them. But later on, pag patagal ng patagal na, dahil nga required, lagi na rin nilang ginagawa. So which what makes it, kaya tayo tuwang-tuwa minsan as teachers pag nagbabasa tayo, tapos pag nakikita natin yung work involved, kahit nasa simpleng forum discussion lang, di ba nakakatuwa siya? So just an example of that would be this, for example. So here, towards the end, so here you can see the discussion of how the conflict and the history. So clearly the student was forced to research about Myanmar's history when parang he was sensing that the poem paints a sort of mocks the kind of hypocrisy. So parang what's interesting for me here is how she talks about, diba, the history. It tracks the history from the lines of Kokota. So here I made them watch poet's performance. So an example of this is
and this next poem attempts to reimagine the fall of Saigon, where I was born, and an interesting happened during that moment. As Saigon was falling to the north during this chaotic and terrible time, the American radio station played Irving Berlin's White Christmas as this coded signal for American personnel to evacuate. And I thought it was such a revealing but charged moment where even the fleeing was a code, where those who could not have access to that language, to that code, are left behind. And in a way, I see that as how language starts to exclude us, or can be used to divide us, to make walls. And so I wove the song through this rewriting of the fall of Saigon. Obad with burning city. Milk flower petals in the street, like pieces of a girl's dress. May your days be merry and bright. He fills a teacup with champagne, brings it to her lips. Open, he says. She opens.
Minsan gumagamit din ako ng videos just to give me some break when I'm talking. But this particularly, I like making them watch poets read their poems, because it gives them a different sense and grasp of the material. It gives them that oral quality, diba? Not just the oral quality, that they can see the poet talking very delicately about language. Because at the end of the day, even though we're not just using literature to make them see Southeast Asia. Diba? I wanted them to appreciate poetry as it is, as poetry. And making them watch these videos helped them gain a deeper sense of appreciation. Especially if, di ba, parang maganda rin nagpa-perform din kasi sa Ocean Vuong ng kanyang mga tula dito. And uh, uh, just like that, ganun din yung ano ko sa kanila. I have few questions, and then, for example, here, because I push my students to do close reading. A student, for example, talks about, diba, the genre of Abad in writing poetry, and tries to parang extend it into a discussion of the fall of Saigon here, and the response. So another, and then she talks about the repetition of particular images. So she's doing a close reading. Of course, it's not, and hindi siya yung isang buong papel, diba? Which might be intimidating to our students. Sometimes we can make them do micro papers, but very focused. So I always tell them, when you are analyzing a text, you don't have to analyze everything. You just analyze the most important aspects of the text that speaks to you. And here, another students would talk about, diba, how Ocean Vuong is also writing about the fall of Saigon as an intergenerational trauma he inherited, because he was never born in Vietnam. Diba? He was completely supposed to be parang separated, cut off from his own history as a refugee, as a kid growing in America. But here it talks about how the persona uses a third person omniscient voice, which describe a story that the narrator is not part of. So what the student sees in in Ocean Vuong's use of third person here is that the use of third person offers a sense of distance. Diba? The third POV, omniscient point of view, offers a sense of distance, which might be a distance that is articulated by intergenerational trauma. So there, this is an example of in the films I made them watch. Nakikita ninyo, may quiz na involved. So this helps me track my student. Ayan na, hindi ko na siya maano. But in any case, so you can see here, pati yung entry, bibliographical entry ng dito rin, kikita ninyo, may quiz. And then, okay. Meron din silang poem na ni Monica Sok dito. Which can be, the poem can be read online sa link dito. And then, okay, an example, so towards the end of each of my modules, I made them do podcasts, which is just a parang hip version of a Zoom recording of them discussing in smaller groups. But some of them would make productions, would do editing, diba? Which it is a good and enjoyable experience for teachers. But I always tell them that I'm more interested in the ways in which they discuss the text. If you can see here, the question and the prompt is a little bit more elaborate. Because we are not discussing just history, we are also discussing music. I made them answer questions specific to the cultural production that they're dealing with. And of course, I give them also parang critical papers or journal articles that may help them or inform their discussion further. I made them quote, even verbally, I made them quote and cite their sources. So for example, they say, according to Linda Satan, in her article, etc., etc. So you just have to be very specific about if you're going to want to get something like this from your students, your instructions have to be very specific. And they have to see that it is graded. It's part of the grading. So, so I made them do. I grouped them into three groups according to three films. So this is just one example of how my students have discussed the role of music in narrativizing the trauma of the Pol Pot regime in Cambodia.
In this film, music codes the people's memory and trauma of the Khmer Rouge reign of terror.
Home and music was pretty much it. That was what's left for us.
Music is what they held onto during the Cambodian Civil War. It made them, perhaps, forget and somehow experience a glimpse of what was once their life before it all happened. In the viewpoint of the artist, this era is marked by immense pain. Pain and trauma that a symbol of freedom was taken away. Used by the Khmer Rouge to craft politically motivated and nationalistic music for their benefit that is against their will. And lastly, to use their voice. The same voice that sung songs of happiness, singing words of killings, nationalism, defense, patriotism, and martyrdom, like that of the experience of Sinsi Samut and some other artists as well.
So that is just one example. So as you can see, the students seem to have created, diba, parang another documentary just by their podcast, which is what I really appreciate kasi so much effort is being is being exerted towards a very simple activity.
Suffering from
Okay. Okay, okay, ano na siya. So I'll just refresh it a bit. So I just want to show you this last clip. This is about the my students' discussion of an Australian film about Laos, yung The Rocket.
It is evident people of Laos are still suffering from the impact of war that ended years ago. As previously mentioned, America bombed Laos for years, wherein they used cluster bombs that had a 30% failure rate and approximately one-third of the bombs dropped did not detonate upon impact. This left Laos contaminated with unexploded ordnances, and this can be seen throughout the film. Like in the scene wherein they visit the village Uncle Purple used to call paradise. As they reach their destination, Toma comes to the realization that the village is empty because of the danger and threat that UXO imposes to the people, that the whole village had to evacuate and relocate to a new area. The characters saw and knew that the village is inhabitable because of the scattered UXO. The film even magnifies the risks of living with UXO. Upon research, the common victims of UXO are children and farmers. The film showed the vulnerability of children to unexploded ordnances in the scene wherein Alo and Kia were playing and mistook a Bombi as a toy and were about to throw it until Uncle Purple intervened. Another evidence is in the scene wandering by himself and ends up discovering a sleeping tiger, plays and tampers with it, and shortly after, he leaves and suddenly, the bomb explodes.
So that is just some of the examples of the outputs my student has created. So in a way, you can see how their effort, how all of these things, how their outputs has become something also my material now, in which I have to synthesize when I do my lecture and when I meet them. So in many ways, I am synthesizing, I am learning things from my students after I've given them the materials in class. So that is the basic structure of how I teach Southeast Asian literary and cultural studies. And I hope that you've gained something from today's lecture, and I'll be looking forward to some of your questions. Maraming salamat po.
Ayan. So maraming salamat, Kaloy, for your very engaging lecture. Actually, I really thought on a personal note that it was organized in such a way that I think our fellow teachers are able to see, number one, the problematization of the subject matter itself, the content, but also there's also a part where you talk about some strategies that may apply to teaching this particular subject, but also can be applicable to the teaching of other subjects. Katulad ng sinabi mo, there was also, you also use some of those techniques when you teach panitikan or literature classes, no? So anyway, I'm very happy to have seen you talk today. And I'm sure the other teachers too are very, very happy. Now we have come to the open forum segment of this lecture. Please be reminded to key in your questions or remarks at the comment section doon sa ating kung saan nakapost ito sa Facebook, no? So I am still waiting for some questions from the audience, but I would like to throw in one question from myself first. And then there's actually one question from an anonymous teacher who isusunod ko right after this. But I think, I'm not sure, but this is just medyo segue. Pumapasok, na-curious lang ako actually, and I don't know if this is very tangential to the topic, but di ba, Lang Liav, for example, there was a recent issue on the works of Lang Liav, being parang hindi naman siya kunwari poetic, di ba? Hindi naman siya masyadong kabilib-bilib, not as impressive, but personally, I think there's something to look at the works of Lang Liav, no? It's interesting to point out that Lang Liav is also a descendant, I think, of Cambodian exiles, no? And I wonder if these kinds of issues like the reception of the works of Lang Liav and her popularity in the United States and other Western countries, and I think here in the Philippines too, and are you able to make connections in relation to how you teach Southeast Asian literature? So yun.
Maraming salamat sa sa napakagandang question na 'yan, no. Kasi parang si Lang Liav kasi parang she never really talks about her identity as a Cambodian descendant diasporic poet, except in, I think, the only incident or moment in which there was parang when there was a mention was when she was answering that Twitter feud about how privileged she is, diba? And then she talks about her upbringing, her difficult upbringing as a Cambodian immigrant in the West. So that was, but she never, I haven't read enough of her work to actually know if she has written her own experience as an immigrant, or whether she has written things that can describe her experience back in Southeast Asia, or even just the trauma. Parang wala pa no? Parang, or maybe perhaps because it's very difficult to express those very complex legacies in your poetics if your poetry is so short, diba? Parang ganon, so short. So but it is interesting how many of these Asian immigrants in the US who basically made it in the scene have practically erased their connection, even if they have already been raised in in the West, which is something that I don't think that it will make her marketable because she's so marketable now. Uh, Lang Liav and even Rupi Kaur, for example. Is she Bangladeshi, si Rupi Kaur? Or basta South Asian, di ba? I wouldn't know. Hindi niya sinasabi. Pero that is, di ba, parang the amount of popularity, they've been so popular that they no longer needed the currency of their ethnicity to market them anymore compared to to other artists parang ganon, to bolster their identity and market sales. So that's a very interesting thing to think about, and that can be something which we can engage our students with, especially in this particular module that they can access all actually with Ocean Vuong and Monica Sok. Ocean Vuong even is a quite a famous writer. Best-selling yung niya, novel niya, yung On Earth We Are Briefly Gorgeous, di ba? Best-selling. And it really talks about the pain of being an immigrant Vietnamese and meron siya ngayon yung Time is Like a Mother, ba? Which talks about her, I'm guessing, his heritage further. So that is a completely very different kind of a poet compared to di ba, Lang Liav. Kaya magandang i-engage sila on that level eh. So why do you think Lang Liav never really talks about her Cambodian bloodline or heritage as compared to Ocean Vuong? And both of them are popular on their own terms. So how does that fare, and what kind of politics is involved in that kind of literary and cultural scene? So yeah.
Right. Yeah. Oo nga, no? And then even if you think about it, you could do a comparative analysis of the way even one reads their poems. Kasi ang hirap, I think, ang hirap basahin ng mga tula ni Ocean as compared to Lang Liav, but it doesn't invalidate naman the poems of Lang Liav, no? It's just that it's different. So it's a, sorry to say this is a terrible pun, but it's a minefield. Oh my God. It's really, it's a load map. It's a load, meron maraming mahuhukay doon. Maraming, I'd rather call it like that. No? Parang it's like it's a place where you can find many things. No? Yun. So what a terrible metaphor. I'm sorry. But let me read the question from our anonymous scholar, teacher mula sa isang AB Lit program from a university outside NCR. Then after that, we'll read the question of Chester Ocampo na nasaan. I think, by the way, for our audience, pusuan niyo po ang ating feed para mapansin na kayo at bumati kayo, and please feel free to greet or also, post your comments or questions and reactions. So from our anonymous viewer, Southeast Asian Studies as an area studies topic, I think, or field, was a product of the Cold War. Organizations built around it, like the ASEAN, continue to be marked by its origins, for better or for worse. Even as we talk to each other directly now as Southeast Asians without the white men as go-between, the Cold War interpolations that lurk deep in the shadows, it still lurk deep within the shadows of today's so-called globalization. So there are three questions. No? Number one, what would be your advice to the would-be teacher to avoid Cold War mentality in a Southeast Asian literary and cultural studies classroom? So number two, how can categories like Nusantara function as an alternative to Southeast Asia? And number three, how can you account, or how can we account for the fact that there's no Southeast Asian writer who has won the Nobel Prize for Literature? So medyo na yan, parang medyo I think that in a class that would cover a few weeks, no, pero parang it's a we hope you can engage that series of questions.
Okay. Sige, iba't iba yung fields na in terms of how to avoid Cold War mentality. I don't think because it's so yun nga, as Chester's is this Chester's question? Tama,
No,
no?
this is the anonymous scholar
Anonymous
first.
scholar.
Pupuntahan ko si Chen.
Okay. It's so difficult to avoid Cold War as a sort of way of framing and informing and shaping Southeast Asian course or Southeast Asian studies course. That's why it's very important to introduce that to students, that much of the ways in which Southeast Asian studies is formed and informed is through the legacies of Cold War politics. But that in itself cannot wrap the things that we can think about Southeast Asia. So so it is always important to go beyond diba? These binaries of that that was produced by Cold War politics in the text that we are reading, and to think about this text in much more complex ways. So for example, in what's interesting, for example, in the act of killing, and that's the reason why I wanted my students to watch that, is they are talking about larger and deeper and more ethical questions about the violence that came about from the violence in Indonesia and the communist purging. So this is not just about diba, Cold War politics. We see this kind of violence played out in the kinds of complicity of the US, diba? And the ways in which makes it possible for us to access products that is oil, yung mga ganun, yung palm oil, ganyan. All of these are in fact sort of entangled in that very violent history of communist purgings. So kahit ikaw was a viewer, as somebody who consumes palm oil that may or may not have come from Indonesia, is sort of put into this light of complicity. Yan ang laging ino-open ni Oppenheimer sa kanyang mga interviews that my students get to encounter because I ask them to research more about the film. So, and it is articulated very well in the film as well. So, they see that Cold War politics is much more complex. It's not just parang communist versus capitalism, and the ways in which this ideological wrangling has operated on the ground in our own history, in our own backyard, have much more complex bearings to us. So, yun yung magandang paraan to be able to avoid binaries. We cannot avoid Cold War mentality or Cold War framing, but what we can avoid is all of those easy explanations that tend to discuss this in Manichaean or black and white terms. I don't know what the second question, if it has something to do with yung parang pre-colonial ideas or pre-colonial categories in Southeast Asia. Yun ba yung tinutungtong? If that is the case, I think it's important, for example, to see how colonialism has reordered the order of things in Southeast Asia, has sort of disrupted the order of things in Southeast Asia in such a way that a lot of the ways in which we understand ourselves has been erased, because of colonialism. But it also we won't be able to recover the things that we've lost, even if we use these terms, diba? The pre-colonial concepts and the pre-colonial ideas. But what we can get from that is a deeper understanding on how, for example, in the documentary on Warya, in Tales of Warya, how some of the ideas of the local idiom or the local concept for queerness is much more complex than the Western idea or conception of queerness. Diba? Pag sa atin yung bakla can have much more complex, can be much more critical categories. So I think that is something that we can make our students appreciate. And then finally, bakit wala pa tayong Nobel Prize winners sa Southeast Asians? Muntik na 'di ba kay Pram? Kaya lang may pumigil na Southeast Asian din. So
Ah!
so I think we can but even Nobel Peace Prize winners, while it is good that if somebody from a region can get that, and I hope, 'di ba, somebody really can get that. But we can also decolonize our idea of ano, 'di ba, the institutions that legitimizes kind of literature. So even if Pram doesn't win Nobel, it doesn't diminish the his literary legacy, 'di ba? So that is another aspect of it. But I do hope that sana naman, no, ang dami-dami na nating writers sa region na mukhang very much qualified for that for that prize.
That's right. So maraming salamat for those comments and that response to that multi-layered or multi-branch question, no? I actually thought of quick reaction lang also, parang iba nga talaga, and this also connects to something that you said earlier about how different our culture is. Naalala ko yung sinabi mo on the thinking that we are Latino Americans lost in Asia. And I have been, although this is something I haven't, this is just a gut reaction. I don't know if this can also play into some discussions related to the subject. When we talk about how politics is playing out here in the country, and we have our, as you can see, the fascists are on the rise again in this country. And nakikita natin na iba pa rin yung politika dito kahit na merong aktivismo na nangyayari. Parang hindi gumagana. Hindi ko alam kung ano yung dahilan. At parang kung ikukumpara sa Latin America, and maybe you can help me with the perspective on this topic at related din naman sa Southeast Asia, no? Parang nakikita ko yung nangyayari doon, yung musika, for example, doon sa South America, yung for example the songs like yung mga kanta ng Kilapayon at saka ng Inti Illimani. These are protest songs that are so popular. El Pueblo Unido, Jamás Será Vencido, diba? Those songs are so popular, and their politics is really, the politics shows it. There are leftist leaders who are getting up the government stage, no? But here in the Philippines, it even with our activism, it doesn't seem to be happening. We have a very, I think we do have a vibrant left, and that's good. But my issue with my concern is why it isn't seeming, we are using very similar materials, like the song which has been transferred here, na hiniram din naman, parang iba yung nangyayari. At baka nga itong sinabi mo about using the pre-colonial terms in order to get to know the culture better, and then the colonial violence, at parang hindi ko alam kung makakatulong ito sa pag-unawa natin sa kaibahan ng mga nangyayari dito. Sorry, may question by Chester, no? But just before I read that, this is just a gut reaction to what's been happening today, and I think it's very related to what you're teaching in Southeast Asians, this Southeast class on Southeast Asia.
Yeah, very interesting yung nangyayari sa sa Latin America and Southeast Asia. Parang polar opposite, parang there seems to be a rise, and left is becoming very popular there. Because they've been winning elections, landslides even. They're gaining so much political legitimacy, while here we are being decimated. The left is being decimated. Progressive groups is being tainted, trolled, attacked, harassed, etc., etc. But at the same time, this all of this development is also a part of a geopolitical, more complex geopolitical politics kasi parang geopolitical gestures and moves of world powers kasi di ba parang both of these are being funded by China as well. So the rise of authoritarians and the rise of the leftist progressive groups in different parts of the world get their money from that's something that we needed to think about as well. Hindi lang din siya while we can judge this in terms of all of these governments rising, we cannot judge that is why nation state has an opposed dash, because there's still something that separates them, and we would like to think that the nation composed of the people and the humanity and the soul are not, and even with the landslide popularity of the politicians and the leaders that we elect, this doesn't reflect the totality of the soul of our people, of the nation. So that's why we needed to go back to teaching literature and culture again, because we would like to think that we can inculcate a different kind of community. Is it the community that we are seeing in more progressive, that gets to be advanced as progressive states in other parts of the countries? Perhaps so, perhaps not. Perhaps it might be a very different community, much more radical than that even. That is what our literature is demanding, after all, a different kind of worlding that doesn't gets to be funded by China. So parang ganon. Or other world powers. So ganon. So yeah, these are the things that I'm sort of also reflecting. It's not as if naman na porket finance tong mga governments na to ng China ay ano na sila, corrupted and tainted, but it is what it is.
Oo. Nga. I think I guess trying to ground my own question and then your response together with it. Parang dyan pumapasok yung importante, talagang I don't know how, I'm connecting it to your citational culture comment earlier, na parang talagang you go down to the details, you go down and research on it, so not to simply make blanket assumptions, no? And I think it's tamang ang literature will play a part now, especially at this time. So I'll go to the question of Chester. Sorry, Chester, medyo na-delay at nakaka-excite din naman kasi yung topic. Sir Carlos, is Southeast Asia turning from a reading culture to a visual culture? So that's his question. Is Southeast Asia turning from a reading culture to a visual culture?
The world is turning into a visual culture. For Dr. Janiel Garcia, we're actually still an oral culture in many ways. Even Southeast Asia, to the largest extent, we're still a very oral culture. Even if you watch TikTok, it's so very oral. So, I don't know. But I'm guessing many of our kids right now would appreciate supplements, visual, audiovisual supplements, and the learning materials that we're producing. I'm talking to one of my fellow teacher in LaSalle, and she's talking about Miss Teresa, right? She's always talking about the difference of learning experience with a page, physical book with a page, and as opposed to with a screen. Kasi even if you're reading, kahit pareho pa yan ng font, kahit pareho pa yan ng font size, di ba? It must be very different to appreciate poetry, when something that you can touch if you have tactile, as opposed to a screen. So may ibang levels of flatness. Which is an ironic thing to say, given that flatness doesn't need to have, it are supposed to have any levels. But I guess there's different levels of flatness in it. in all of these mediums that we needed to be a little bit more familiar with. But at the same time, kahit naman sa visual, ang difficulty ng mga bata is uh, read read anything, to analyze anything, whether it is on the text, material, physical, or on the screen. Kaya nga, there are sessions sometimes, kapag nagpapanood ako ng pelikula, for example, and when you ask them to analyze the film, what they usually give you are summaries of what has happened in the film. In the same manner, when you ask them to analyze, minsan nga kahit poems diba? They're summarizing it as if poems have plot, diba? Or just like short stories. But some summaries are not analysis. I always tell them that. So the same way that I ask them to isolate an image, ganun din yung ginagawa natin sa 'di ba, sa fiction. I want them to analyze, 'di ba? Just one element of the whole fiction. I ask them to just give me 2 summaries. If you're going to summarize a short story or even a novel or even a book, 2 sentences will do, and then focus on one thing and one thing only. Whether it's a paper, whether it is a discussion page, a discussion forum, yun lang, isang bagay lang. And then ganun din sa pelikula. Focus on one scene. How was it shot? So I do almost orally, pinapaliwanag ko sa kanya, this is how I will explain this particular scene in a film, even if it's documentary, even if it's feature film. So ano yung framing? What is included in the frame? Ano yung point of view na ginamit ng director? And this is where it becomes difficult for them. But if you keep on pushing them, prodding them, asking them all the time, then they'll arrive at that point wherein they become more comfortable with talking about camera angles in paper, and talking about non-diegetic and diegetic elements. So it is difficult. It is even difficult for us sometimes, diba, to focus on these little things. But we need to keep on reminding ourselves that one of our, diba, most reliable armaments has been close reading. Whether we are new critics or not, whether we believe in new criticism or not, even if we are Marxist, feminist, we still go back to close reading. So ang anong tanong na lang dyan, where will we bring the things, to what insight, to what end are we going to arrive to when we use close reading?
So that's great, no? Ang halaga talaga ng close reading, pero ang nakikita ko rin, no, Kaloy, dun sa what I'm seeing is that there is an implicit focus on an ethical perspective in the way the analysis is done. Even if maybe the word ethics is not brought up all the time, implicit yon in the choices, and I think that's something that our fellow teachers will might benefit from. Always think about the ethics even of your choices of exercise selections, and even the way you arrange the materials, like the way you arrange and frame the way the materials will be studied within a class in Southeast Asia. Maybe since we're moving towards the end of our discussion today, I'd like to ask something about one thing that I saw in your discussion. Pati ako na-engage talaga, no? So it's very, very, very good. No? Thank you very much. May concern about kasi sinabi mo bilang guro, nagiging curator ka. And I think that's a very powerful material to discuss, no? Kasi parang napag-usapan niya namin na isa kong friend, and sabi ko kasi yung curation ay it's something that's supposed to cure, right? Kasi cure yan pero yung curation, pero nandun din yung baggage niya ng cura, like for example cura, right? So parang it's very and to a certain extent there is an issue on curation apparently. I don't know if this is just in art studies, but also in related fields wherein there is what hegemony. There is now while I can see that as a curator teacher, you are the one na it's no longer the white men who are the dead white men we subscribe to, but you are as the agent coming up with new materials and new ways of understanding. But I guess we cannot do away with the fact that at some point somebody else will have to assume agency, and in this classroom setting it is our students, no? So I wonder if they are also how do you is it something that you explicitly state that this particular methodologies that you use in teaching are things that are ways to exercise their own agency? Are they do they become curators themselves or agents themselves, or are these negotiable, or what are negotiable and what are not negotiable? So yun lang.
I always tell my students that everything is negotiable. Except their final grade. Yeah, everything is negotiable, even the materials. So I create everything here. Everything is available to them. Or if it's not, they have to pay a little bit. For example, if they are going to watch it on Vimeo. But if kasi lalo na yung mga this is during the first term, yung salasal, yung first few months of the pandemic, and the students are not yet as exhausted but very much anxious. So most of the time, even when we are meeting, we always have 10 minutes to check up on each other. Kung iba, parang we do that as part of our rituals now online. But I have noticed that it becomes harder and harder. So the second time I teach this, I always tell my students everything is negotiable. If you think that there's too many material in this, I can consider taking them out, or reducing some requirements. Just to, lahat naman tayo, we are dealing with things, and sometimes we also recalibrating what we think are the most important things when we are assessing students' performance. So in the same manner that we are very conscious of the powers that we are trying to repudiate in our discipline as teachers, we also try our best to not to replicate power structures that we so vehemently oppose to. But there's also a recognition that sometimes it is quite difficult to, it's quite difficult to be as for a lack of better term, to be so free with their students, to give them as much agency as they can. But I think once you offer the sense of openness, even with the design that you saw, that you spend so many nights preparing for, but you also have to let that go. In a way, because you also have to recognize that, it's nice to watch this, it's nice to be able to learn from this, but at the end of the day, is this the most important thing? And I always tell my students that they can always ask me for access to some of the materials that they weren't able to do. And this becomes yung first set of students ko, kasi sila yung pinakabibo kasi bago pa yung pandemic, but later on medyo nahihirapan na, and I get that, and we have to be able to find a way to bargain with our students, and then when they see that you are doing your best, and then just they will appreciate your openness to to negotiate with them. and hopefully they'll return it by doing the best that they can with the things that they were able to bargain with. So ayun.
Ang ganda. That answer, I think, is I think on a practical level, for teachers, that's great because it's really how we can work with what we're trying to teach. But at the same time, there's also an awareness that the framework in which we are teaching is also something that we sometimes have to interrogate. And that's also in relation to how things are framed in Southeast Asian studies. And these are all calls to self-reflexivity, especially, and this is my way of wrapping up, Sir Kaloy, no? This is also about, you spoke about how, for example, the left is being decimated, violence is being inflicted upon them. There's a lot of violence happening now, and this is implicit also in other structures, intellectual, academic, otherwise. So we also do our part to, while also maintaining the rigor of our discipline and the useful rigor of our disciplines, we try to interrogate and question. Tama ba? Parang Kerry naman, no?
Yes, yes. I think we try to cultivate the kind of community that we want. We don't want, diba, in our community, trolls trolling us all the time. That's a different kind of violence. We do not want seeing our friends being harassed, being red tagged as communist people just because they fight for their causes. So we inculcate that sense to our students that, we do this out of our sense of compassion and fellow feeling. But if we fail to do that, even in the things that we are designing, diba? Even with best intentions, that becomes a problem.
Yeah, so that's a beautiful way to put that, Kaloy. So thank you very much for engaging us today, and for sharing your expertise, your experience, and even clearly your passion for not only for the subject but also for the people who are affected by this particular subject. So thank you, Dr. Piocos, for your very informative lecture. Surely our co-teachers in the literature field have found another set of insights that can enhance our students' classroom experience. So the class and Unitas team would like to present you with the following certificate of appreciation. Let me just pull up the text. Certificate of Appreciation is presented by Class Incorporated General Assembly co-sponsored by Unitas to Carlos M. Piocos III, PhD, for sharing his knowledge and expertise as the speaker of class lecture series titled Teaching Southeast Asian Cultural Studies, conducted online on July 1, 2022, signed Professor Maria Luisa Torres Reyes, PhD, Editor-in-Chief of Unitas and President of Cultural Literary Art Studies Society Incorporated, or CLAS. So again, Kaloy, maraming salamat. I would like to invite everyone who's here, and also, if Dr. Piocos, if Kaloy would be interested to join us another time, yung mga iba ding magsasalita, on July 8, so this is our list of class lecture series offerings. On July 8, next Friday, it's Mr. Francis Soliano, teaching law and literature. The next Friday, July 15, Milagros Laurel, Dr. Laurel, teaching literature in the language classroom. July 22, the next Friday, Dr. Cristina Pantoja, popularly known as Jing Hidalgo, teaching creative writing and creative nonfiction. And finally, on July 29, 3 p.m., Reverend Father Jesus J. Miranda of the Order of Preachers, teaching about constructivist education. So class would like to thank the thousands of viewers who have been asking interesting questions, contributing to the discussions with their remarks, or even just having been there, quietly listening, watching, and taking down notes as our lectures are going on. Now, may I remind everybody to have more access to the videos and to the link, the schedules, please follow the official Facebook pages of CLAS and Unitas so that ma-update po kayo. So again, this is Nico Vitug. Thank you very much and a good afternoon. Again, Kaloy, maraming salamat.